Welcome to the deep dive. We cut through the noise, delivering essential insights so you can be truly well-informed. Today, we're tackling something really fascinating, a core challenge in modern stats and machine learning. How do you handle probability distributions that are just incredibly complex? So complex, they're essentially impossible to compute directly.
Yeah, this is a huge roadblock, especially in Bayesian statistics, right? Where understanding that posterior density, your updated beliefs after seeing data is, well, everything.
It sounds like trying to predict exactly where a leaf will land in a hurricane by mapping every single gust of wind.
That's a pretty good analogy, actually. For many realistic, complex models, these exact calculations, often involving these really nasty integrals, are just unfeasible, impractical. It really highlights why we need powerful approximate inference methods.
Right, so if the exact answer is off the table, what's the alternative? You need a smart workaround, and that's precisely where variational inference, VI for short, comes in. It's a really powerful method from machine learning.
And it offers this brilliant solution. Instead of trying to sample from these messy distributions, like some other methods.
Like MCMC, Markov chain, Monte Carlo.
Exactly. Instead of sampling, VI approximates them using optimization. It reframes the problem.
Optimization, okay. And what's the big advantage there?
Well, what's really interesting is that this optimization approach is often way faster and, crucially, much easier to scale up to massive data sets compared to those classical sampling methods like MCMC. It's a fundamental shift in thinking, really. It's opened up a lot of new possibilities.
Okay, so let's dive into this. Our mission today is to really unpack the core ideas behind SIX. We want to explore its mechanics, get a grip on why it's so valuable, and, highlight its incredibly broad applications. It pops up everywhere.
Yeah, it does. And we'll be drawing on a pretty foundational review paper and some insightful lecture notes to guide us through this.
Great. So before we get to VI itself, let's just nail down that fundamental roadblock again. What makes inference, especially Bayesian inference, so hard?
Okay, so in Bayesian inference, the whole game is computing the posterior density. We often write it as PZX. That's the probability of our unknowns, the latent variable Z, given the data X we've observed.
Makes sense. Updated beliefs.
Exactly. But the challenge is calculating this, PZX. According to Bayes' theorem, you need to divide the joint probability, PZX, by the marginal probability of the data, PZX, this PX term. It's often called the evidence or marginal likelihood.
And getting that PX involves integrating out all those unknown Z variables from the joint probability, right?
Precisely. And that integral, the evidence integral, that's usually the killer. For so many interesting complex models, it's either unavailable in closed form, meaning there's no neat formula for it, or calculating it requires exponential time. It just becomes computationally intractable.
The exponential time, that sounds bad.
It is. Let's make it concrete.
Yeah.
Think about a Bayesian mixture of Gaussians. You have data, you think it comes from, say, k different bell curves, but you don't know which point belongs to which curve or the exact shapes of the curves.
Okay.
When you try to calculate that px denominator for this model, you end up with a sum that can involve k raised to the power of n terms. N is your number of data points.
Wow, k to the power of n.
Yeah. If n is even, reasonably large, maybe a few hundred or 1,000, the number just explodes. K to the n becomes computationally impossible. It's a serious bottleneck.
Okay, that's a computational nightmare for sure. So exact calculation is out, MCMC sampling can work, but you said it struggles with massive data sets or complex models.
Right. MCMC draws samples that converge to the true posterior, which is great, but it can be slow, especially with lots of data. You might need millions of samples. So for large data sets or very complex models, you often need a faster approximate conditional. And that's where VI steps in.
By shifting from sampling to optimization?
Exactly. It finds an approximation much more quickly, even if it's not perfectly the true posterior.
All right, we understand the problem scale. So how does variational inference actually tackle this? What's the core philosophy?
The core idea is quite clever, really. Instead of sampling from that intractable PZX, VI uses optimization. It starts when you posit a family of approximate densities Q over your latent variable Z.
Okay, so you choose a set of simpler, manageable probability distributions, like choosing from a toolbox of simple shapes.
Exactly. Think of Q as a family of tractable distributions, maybe all Gaussians, or maybe distributions that factorize in a simple way. You're hoping one of these simple shapes can approximate your complex target.
And then you find the best fit within that chosen family.
Precisely. You then try to find the member of that family, let's call it QZ, that minimizes the Kullback-Leibler-Kale divergence to the exact posterior, PZX. This optimized density, QZ, becomes your proxy, your stand-in for the true, difficult posterior.
KL divergence. Can you remind us what that is?
Sure, the KL divergence is an information theoretic measure. It basically quantifies how much one probability distribution differs from a second reference distribution. It's always non-negative, and it's zero only if the two distributions are identical. So minimizing KL means making QZ as close as possible to PZX.
But wait, you said minimizing KL directly is hard because it involves the very thing we can't compute.
Ah, yes, that's the catch. The formula for KL divergence between QZ and PZX actually contains that log PX term, the log evidence, which is intractable.
So how do you minimize something you can't fully calculate?
This is where it gets really ingenious. You can't minimize KL directly, so instead Vive maximizes something called the evidence lower bound, or ELBO. The math works out beautifully. Maximizing the ELBO is provably equivalent to minimizing the KL divergence.
Wow.
Because the log evidence, log PX, is constant with respect to the choice of QZ. The ELBO is basically log PX minus the KL divergence. So if you make the ELBO bigger, since log PX is fixed, the KL divergence must get smaller.
That's clever. You optimize a related quantity that is tractable, and it indirectly optimizes the thing you actually care about.
Exactly. It's a mathematical backdoor. You're moving towards the best approximation without ever needing to compute the intractable evidence term itself.
Brilliant. So what does the ELBO look like? What does maximizing it encourage intuitively?
The ELBO itself usually breaks down into two intuitive terms. One term encourages the approximate distribution QZ to explain the observed data. Well, this often looks like an expected log likelihood. The other term encourages QZ to remain close to the prior distribution PZ. This usually involves a negative KL divergence between QZ and the prior.
Ah, so it balances fitting the data with staying close to our initial beliefs, the prior.
Precisely. It mirrors the usual balance between likelihood and prior. That's fundamental to Bayesian modeling. It feels very natural.
And why lower bound?
Because it turns out that the ELBO is always less than or equal to the log evidence, log PX ELBO. It provides a lower bound on the model evidence, which can sometimes be useful in itself, maybe for model comparison. This property often comes from applying Jensen's inequality.
Got it. And just quickly, how does this relate to something like the expectation maximization EM algorithm? Some listeners might know that one.
Good question. EM is often used for finding maximum likelihood estimates in models with latent variables. The E step in EM involves calculating an expectation under the exact posterior predictive distribution of the latent variables. 6 is essentially what you use when that E step is intractable. When you can't compute that expectation exactly, VI finds an approximation QZ and uses that instead. So V tackles the harder problem.
Okay, so V optimizes to find the best fit QZ from a chosen family Q. You mentioned choosing simpler families. What's a really common choice?
One of the most widely used is the mean field variational family. It makes a strong simplifying assumption.
Yes.
It assumes that all the latent variables Z are mutually independent in the approximate distribution QZ. Each variable Zj is governed by a distinct factor, QjZj. So the full approximate distribution, QZ, just becomes a product of these individual factors. QZ equals Q1, Z1, Q2, Z2.
Independence. That definitely sounds like it would simplify things, computationally speaking.
Immensely. It makes the optimization problem much more manageable, but of course there's a trade-off.
Right. What's the downside of assuming independence?
The downside is that this mean field family almost certainly does not contain the true posterior if the latent variables are actually dependent in reality, which they often are. Think about a true posterior that's a tilted ellipse, representing correlation between two variables. A mean field approximation would force that ellipse to be axis-aligned, losing the correlation structure entirely. It decouples the variables.
So you lose fidelity, you lose the ability to capture dependencies between variables in your approximation.
Exactly. You sacrifice some accuracy for computational tractability. There are more advanced methods like structured variational inference that try to reintroduce some dependencies, make the family Q richer, but they're generally harder to optimize. Mean field is often the starting point.
Okay, sticking with mean field for now, how do we actually optimize the ELBO within this family? How do we find the best independent factors?
One of the standard workhorses is an algorithm called coordinate ascent variational inference, or TAVI.
Coordinate ascent. Sounds like climbing a hill one direction at a time.
That's a perfect analogy. CAVI iteratively optimizes each factor, QJ, one by one, while holding all the other factors fixed. In each step, you update one QJ to maximize the ELBO, given the current state of all the others. You cycle through the variables, updating each one,
And you keep doing this until...
until the ELBO stops improving significantly. You're essentially climbing the ELBO to a local optimum, coordinate by coordinate.
And what does the update rule for each factor QJ actually look like? Is it complicated?
Often, it's surprisingly elegant, especially for certain types of models. The core update rule says that the optimal factor QJ EJ is proportional to the exponentiated expected log of the complete conditional of ZJ.
Okay, unpack complete conditional again.
The complete conditional for a variable ZJ is its probability distribution given all the other latent variables, Z excluding ZJ, and the observed data X. So the CAVI update involves taking the logarithm of this conditional distribution, then taking its expectation, average value, with respect to all the other Q factors for variables other than ZJ, and then exponentiating the result.
Interesting. You mentioned MCMC earlier. How does this compare to Gibbs sampling? I remember that also uses complete conditionals.
It's a very insightful comparison. Both CVI and Gibbs sampling rely on the same complete conditional distribution. But Gibbs sampling draws a random sample from that complete conditional in each step. CVI, on the other hand, takes the expected log of the complete conditional and uses that expectation to deterministically update the parameters of the variational factor QJ.
So sampling versus calculating an expectation to update parameters.
Precisely. That's a key difference. TAVI is deterministic given the current state, while Gibbs is stochastic.
Okay, practicalities. You said KEI finds a local optimum. What does that mean for users?
It means that because the ELBO is generally a non-convex objective function, it can have multiple peaks, like a mountain range KVI only guarantees finding a peak, not necessarily the highest one.
Ah, so where you start matters.
Exactly. The results could be sensitive to initialization. If you start the algorithm with different random values for your Q factors, you might end up converging to different local optimas with different ELBO values. You often see plots showing ELBO trajectories from different random starts converging to slightly different final values. It's something to be aware of. Running it multiple times might be necessary.
Okay, let's bring this back to our concrete example. The Bayesian mixture of Gaussians. How would KVI work there?
Right. So in that model, we have latent variables for cluster assignments, which Gaussian does each data point belong to, and latent variables for the parameters of each Gaussian component, their means and variances. Applying mean field VI means we'll have variational factors for the assignment, say QC, and variational factors for the component parameters, say QE.
And the mean field assumption means these are independent.
Yes, QC would factorize into QC QI, and often QA itself would further factorize across the K components, and maybe even between QI for each component. The CAVI updates then involve cycling between updating the assignment factors and the component factors.
How do they influence each other?
The update for the variational cluster assignment probability for a data point belonging to cluster K, let's call this, will depend on the expected values computed under the current variational distribution for the component parameters. Conversely, the update for the variational parameters of component K, like its mean MK and variance S2K in the variational distribution, will depend on the assignment probabilities, summed over all data points weighted by their contribution to that cluster.
So they feed into each other iteratively. Assignments depend on current components. Components depend on current assignments.
Exactly. It's this iterative refinement until convergence.
And does this work well in practice for mixtures?
Yes, quite well. Simulation studies show how the variational density of the component starts off broad or misplaced, and then sharpens and moves closer to the true components as KVI iterates. And watching the ELBO climb is informative too. You often see these elbows or plateaus in the ELBO plot.
What do those elbows signify?
They often indicate phases where the algorithm is making significant changes to the approximation, perhaps reassigning clusters or dramatically shifting component parameters, as it navigates that non-convex landscape towards a local optimum.
Fascinating. And beyond simulations, what about real data? You mentioned image analysis.
Right. A cool application is grouping images based on color profiles. You can represent each image by its color histograms, how much red, green, blue it has overall. You concatenate these histograms into one long vector, maybe a 576-dimensional representation, as mentioned in the source. Now, each image is just a point in high-dimensional space.
And you can run a VI on those points.
Exactly. Fit a Bayesian Gaussian mixture model using clay VI. The study showed fitting a 30-cluster model to 10,000 images took less than a minute.
Less than a minute for 10,000 images. That's impressive.
It really is. Compared to a traditional MCMC approach, which might take hours or even days for the same task, VI's was orders of magnitude faster. That speed makes analyzing large image data sets feasible.
That scalability seems to be a recurring theme. Is there something about the structure of these models that makes IZ particularly efficient?
Yes, absolutely. A large and really important class of models have their complete conditionals in the exponential family.
Exponential family, like Gaussians, Poisson, gamma, distributions like that.
Exactly. For models built from these blocks, like Bayesian mixtures, many hierarchical regressions, mixed membership models, something wonderful happens. The key AVI update rule simplifies dramatically. The optimal variational factors, QJ, automatically take on the same parametric form as their corresponding complete conditionals.
So if the complete conditional is Gaussian, the optimal Q factor is also Gaussian.
Precisely. And finding the parameters of that Q factor just involves calculating the expected parameter of the complete conditional under the current variational distributions for the other variables. It streamlines the whole process immensely.
That sounds like a huge advantage for implementing V for many common models.
It is. It makes V much easier to derive and apply for a wide range of standard statistical models.
But standard CAI still has that limitation. It requires iterating through the entire data set at each iteration. What about truly massive data? Millions or billions of data points.
Right. For truly web-scale data, CEVI becomes too slow. You can't afford to scan the whole data set for every single update. This is where stochastic variational inference, or SVI, comes in. It's a major breakthrough for scaling 6.
Stochastic, meaning it uses randomness.
Yes, specifically it uses stochastic optimization. Instead of calculating the update based on the entire data set, SVI calculates a noisy but much cheaper update based on just a small random subset, a mini batch of the data at each step. It combines this with natural gradients.
Natural gradients, what are those?
Think of them as a smarter way to follow the gradient uphill on the ELBO surface. Standard gradients operate in Euclidean space, but probability distributions have their own geometry. Natural gradients respect that geometry, often leading to much faster convergence, especially when dealing with the noise from mini batches.
So, noisy updates, but smarter steps.
Kind of, yeah. And the really amazing part, SVI typically requires no new derivation beyond what is needed for CVI. If you've worked out the CVI updates for your model, you can usually plug them into the SVI framework pretty directly.
That makes it incredibly powerful for scaling existing models.
Absolutely. A prime example is probabilistic topic models, like latent Dirichlet allocation, LDA. These models find hidden topics in large collections of documents.
Right, like finding themes in news articles or scientific papers.
Exactly. Before SVI, analyzing maybe tens or hundreds of thousands of documents with LDA was feasible, but slow. With SVI, researchers could suddenly analyze millions of documents. The example mentioned was analyzing 1.8 million articles from the New York Times. SVI made that possible.
That's a complete game changer for fields like NLP.
Definitely. And this scalability and applicability extend far beyond topic models. 6 in its various forms is used all over the place.
Let's maybe touch on some of those diverse areas.
Sure. In computational biology, it's crucial for things like genome-wide association studies, GWAS, figuring out gene regulatory networks, analyzing population genetics, understanding gene expression patterns.
Yeah.
Complex biological data often needs these kinds of models.
Okay, what about vision?
In computer vision and robotics, SOB pops up in inferring nonlinear structures in image data, object tracking, image denoising, and even things like place recognition for robots trying to map their environment.
And the brain.
Computational neuroscience uses it too. Analyzing high-frequency time series like fMRI data, fitting complex hierarchical models of brain activity, even building brain-computer interfaces.
Wow, language too, besides topic models.
Oh, yeah. Natural language processing and speech recognition use it for parsing sentences, grammar induction, hidden Markov models for speech. The list goes on.
It's almost overwhelming how broad it is.
It really is. And beyond those, you see VI used in marketing, like customer segmentation, optimal control and reinforcement learning, analyzing social networks, modeling data in astrophysics, and across the social sciences. It's become a truly fundamental tool for approximate Bayesian inference.
Okay, so VI is powerful, fast, scalable, and widely applicable. But it's not perfect, right? There must be limitations in areas where research is still active.
Absolutely. It's a very active field. One area is exploring alternatives to the KL divergence we talked about specifically, KLQP. Researchers are looking into other measures like alpha divergences or methods related to expectation propagation, EP.
We'll look beyond KL.
These alternative divergences might offer different trade-offs. Minimizing KLQP tends to find approximations Q that are zero, where the true posterior P is zero, sometimes leading to overly compact approximations that underestimate variance. Other divergences might behave differently, perhaps leading to tighter bounds or better approximations in some sense, although they might be harder to optimize.
That relates to the mean field limitation too, right? The independence assumption.
Exactly. The strong independence assumptions of mean field 6 are convenient, but often unrealistic, leading to those underestimated posterior variances. So a lot of research focuses on structured variational inference methods that build dependencies back into the approximation queue or other ways to develop better approximations while maintaining efficient optimization. It's a balancing act.
Get closer to the truth without losing all the speed benefits.
Precisely. Another big open area is the theoretical side. Compared to MCMC, where we have decades of research on convergence properties and error bounds, the statistical properties of variational inference are not yet well understood. Understanding 6 as an estimator, how biased is it? What are its confidence intervals? How does it compare theoretically to the exact posterior? That's an important open area of research.
We know it works well empirically, but the deep theory is still developing.
In many ways, yes. And finally, there's the challenge of applying Z to models where the standard recipes don't easily work.
Like models that aren't built from those nice exponential family distributions.
Right. Think about Bayesian logistic regression, for example. The posterior isn't conjugate. The updates aren't simple closed-form expressions. So there's work on tailored bounds for specific models, methods using auxiliary variables to make things tractable, and exciting developments in black box variational inference.
Black box 6, what's that?
The idea is to create V's methods that work for almost any model you can write down without needing model-specific derivations. They often rely on Monte Carlo estimates of the gradients of the ELBO and integrate tightly with probabilistic programming systems like Stan, PyMain, Pyro. The goal is derivation-free, easy-to-use 6.
Making this powerful technique accessible to even more people and more models.
That's the dream, lowering the barrier to entry.
Well, this has been a really illuminating deep dive. To try and summarize, variational inference is this incredibly powerful optimization-based framework. It lets us approximate these really complex, otherwise intractable probability distributions that are so common in modern science and machine learning.
Yeah, its key advantages are really speed and scalability compared to traditional sampling methods like MCMC. It turns an integration problem into an optimization problem.
Making it an indispensable tool, really, for tackling challenging inference problems across just a huge array of fields, as we've seen.
It's a beautiful example of finding a practical, computationally feasible path when the direct route is blocked.
Absolutely. And it makes you wonder, doesn't it? As variational inference keeps evolving, as these methods get better and easier to use, what new frontiers will they help us unlock? What complex systems, from the mysteries inside our own brains to the structure of the universe, will we be able to model and understand next, thanks to these kinds of techniques?
It's exciting to think about.
Definitely. And for you listening, maybe consider how these powerful approximate inference tools might open up new avenues in your own work or areas of interest. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.